Welcome to the Jackson Square Ventures Book Club. My name is Greg Gretsch, and I'm a co-founder and managing director here at Jackson Square Ventures. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Tonight's guest author is Angel Au-Yeung. Angel is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal's Finance Bureau. Her reporting is primarily focused on how fintech affects everyday consumers. She's won several national awards for her work, including investigations into a Russian billionaire's ownership of dating app Bumble and the downfall of FTX. Tonight, Angel is here to discuss the book she co-authored with her former Forbes colleague, David Jeans. That book is Wonder Boy, Tony Hsieh, Zappos, and the Myth of Happiness in Silicon Valley. Before this book, most of us knew the primary contours of Tony's Hsieh's story. Some of you probably worked with him or knew him personally. I didn't have that pleasure, but I know many who did. As we all know, the Silicon Valley startup community is tight-knit. Anyone you don't know directly is likely just one connection away. Such was the case for me with Tony. I was building startups in Silicon Valley during the dot-com era, and so had several friends who were involved with Link Exchange. I had a front row seat, if you will. That's why I followed their success very closely. Their sale to Microsoft was a very big deal when it happened in 1998. After I'd sold my last company in September of 1999, I was connected with Zappos' original founder, and if you read the book, you know the original founder, Nick Swinmurn, who was looking for advice and investment. We're all victims of our own experience, and so it was for me in that particular case. As a young child, I had attempted to sell shoes door to door. It didn't end well. And so I thought, there's no way that people are gonna be able to sell shoes online, and so I passed. But Tony, like every great entrepreneur, saw something that others did not. He invested and jumped in with both feet, and we all watched over the next decade plus as he turned Zappos into a household name. So when we heard the news in the fall of 2020 that Tony had died in a fire, the initial reaction was shock, sadness, and that sense of loss you feel when someone so exceptional passes so young. The sadness only deepened when we learned that there were drugs involved. For me, that's where the emotions remained until I read Wonder Boy. Wonder Boy turned my sadness into anger. Anger at those who should have stepped in but didn't. Even more anger at those who saw the self-destruction and yet, instead of stepping in, took advantage of the situation for personal gain and enrichment. Tony Hsieh revolutionized both the tech world and corporate culture. He was a business visionary. He was also, as the book explores, a man in search of happiness. How did it all go so wrong? Angel and co-author David Jeans conducted hundreds of interviews in a quest to answer that question. Tonight, we'll discuss how this tragic story fits into the discourse around mental health in the entrepreneurial ecosystem, and what lessons, if there are any, entrepreneurs should take away from it. With that, let's get started.
Great, what an intro. Thank you so much.
Well, I had to, it's funny when this book first came up, that story of Nick Swinmurn, not everyone keeps all of their email, and obviously Gmail didn't exist in 1999,
sure, yeah.
But I had ported my email over from email system to email system, and I still had the emails.
Oh, did you? So did you get in touch with Nick when the book came out?
No, I didn't get in touch with Nick. And I knew Nick, so the startup story, someone who worked for me was a high school classmate of Nick's.
Of course.
Which is how.
Yeah, such a small world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, but before we dive into Tony's story, I wanted to ask a little bit about your journey as an author. This is your first book. Mm-hmm. It's a very impressive book. Thank you. You've been a journalist for 10 plus years. And digging through some of the stories, you've written a lot about a lot of interesting entrepreneurs. The Bumble story, the FTX story, both probably represent a book on their own. Is that the path we're going in from here?
I actually regretted not writing a book about Bumble, but now we're a couple of years after that. I don't know if I would love to write another book, and I love writing these types of biographies about consequential people. But with this book, it wasn't something that we were out to write. It was a story that really fell in our laps. And I really think that those are the best types of stories. I mean, for me, when I try looking for a good story, it never works out. But when I kind of just live life and move through life, it kind of just finds its way into my lap. So that's kind of what happened with the FTX story. That's how it happened with the Bumble story. And that's certainly how it happened with Tony's story. So yeah, I'd love to write another book, but I think I just have to be patient and wait for it to come.
Wait for it to come. So, talking about Tony, you have reported on, and I'm sure communicated with, a lot of exceptional entrepreneurs and a lot of interesting companies. If you were to try to break down the things that set Tony apart, what do you think those things were?
Well, I think what was so unique and interesting about Tony was that, well, he was really a symbol for what the classic Silicon Valley founder is. But what was different about him was his obsession with happiness. I don't think that's something that you hear a lot from Silicon Valley founders. They're obsessed with solving some kind of a problem in the world, but not necessarily about how you can achieve happiness. And I think when you look at his story now, maybe that was a question that he really wanted to answer because he was struggling to answer it for himself. And so with Tony, he wrote this book called Delivering Happiness, which I don't know if you guys, I've started noticing this in the last couple of years, but I've started seeing it on Amazon packages and on the vans of Amazon delivery trucks. That's something that Tony coined. And so when Amazon bought Zappos, Jeff Bezos basically bought Tony Hsieh. And so that's when you started seeing that motto really all on Amazon packaging and vans. But he wrote this book called Delivering Happiness, and his answer to the question of how you achieve happiness was by focusing on the happiness of others, which meant making your employees happy and being maniacal about how to make your customers happy. But I think that with Tony, he equated happiness with excitement, and he equated happiness with commercial success. And when you look at what happened with Tony's life, that might not be the correct answer to how to achieve happiness. So I think that was what was so unique about Tony. He was just so singularly obsessed with this question of happiness that made him a really unique person to look at and report on.
So the happiness thing, when you look at his entrepreneurial journey, starting in school,
yeah,
right, and then in college, the happiness thing didn't come in until Zappos, at least in the way that you tell the story. And I guess that kind of makes sense because Zappos' success was probably a direct result of how happy their customers were. Ultimately, make really happy customers. In a consumer business, you do that. Link Exchange wasn't a consumer business. Mm-hmm. Did you see sort of the seeds of that in his other entrepreneurial endeavors or in the other interactions that you reported on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when he was in college at Harvard, he talked about how he had never been happier than when he was surrounded by his friends, working on class assignments and trying to think of the next big idea to build a company at. And so he really loved that dorm-like quality where you work and live with your friends. That was what brought him happiness. And so he tried to replicate the Harvard dorm room with Link Exchange. So with Link Exchange, he got venture funding, and then he convinced all of his friends to buy apartments in the same building. And so it was a replica of that dorm life in college. And so, with Link Exchange, he sold it in his 20s for just under $300 million. And then when he was building Zappos, he again tried to replicate that dorm-like quality because he found that he was at his happiest when he was surrounded and working with his friends. And so, yeah, you saw the seeds of that all the way back in the Harvard college dorm days. And it just kind of kept, he was desperately trying to grasp to that collegiate dorm-like environment, even though his ideas and his companies were getting bigger and bigger. And so with Zappos, he moved the whole company to Las Vegas. And again, it was that work hard, play hard mentality. You bring your whole life to work and you live with the people that you work. And then the next big thing after Zappos was Downtown Project, which was his city as a startup venture where he decided to dedicate $350 million to revitalizing downtown Vegas. But that actually meant creating his own dorm in Las Vegas and attracting entrepreneurs, his friends to move to Vegas and just, have that dorm-like quality in downtown Vegas. So yeah, I mean, you kind of saw that kernel from the very, very early days.
So this bringing people together was obviously something that goes way back. But one of the things that struck me in the book was Tony as a leader. And obviously when he was doing his things as a kid, he was the leader. He's leading his brothers or what have you. Yeah. But as he got older, Link Exchange, it was kind of the three in a box. It wasn't Tony, the front man out there. When you get to Zappos and obviously the Downtown Project, then it is very much Tony's the point of the spear. Like he's the clear leader there. What do you think changed over that time? That did he grow into that? Was it?
Well, I think Harvard and Link Exchange were really formative years for him developing into a leader. So when we spoke with people that went to college with him, they said that Tony was, even though he was quiet and maybe not the most sociable person, he didn't drink in college, he never touched alcohol, never touched drugs. He was always kind of the connector of the group. So he always offered his dorm room as the place for all of his friends to come together and hang out in. And so when he was starting Link Exchange, he was in his early 20s. He was no longer within the confines of his parental upbringing and no longer within the confines of college. And so that is really when he started to drink. And we had people that worked for him in Link Exchange who said they were surprised when Tony would take a tequila shot, but they also slowly saw him using alcohol as a social lubricant. So in the early days when there were all hands for Link Exchange, he would be standing in the front of the room and he would be staring at his feet would be shuffling and his hands would be behind his body, and he was not a natural leader. But I think when you're building a company, you're forced to have leadership qualities. And with Tony, alcohol also helped in getting him to open himself up and get others to open up to him. And so during the Link Exchange days, that was really that was when he started breaking out of his mold. And I think a lot of that was helped by alcohol, which, for better or for worse, was really the beginning of his addiction issues.
And do you think, what struck me about the Link Exchange time was drink exchange. And that was sort of the pivotal point.
Yeah.
Did the drinking predate that? Did drink exchange, was that what started it? And can you explain what drink exchange was for it?
Yes. So drink exchange was basically these regular happy hours that the company would hold in downtown San Francisco. And the idea of it was to basically create a community and also expose people in San Francisco to the company. And so it became this big event that SF Chronicle would write about. And the company was called Link Exchange, so Drink Exchange was a play on the company name. And I'm not quite sure whether Tony started drinking because of Drink Exchange or Drink Exchange started because Tony started drinking, but it was definitely all related. And this was definitely the moment when Tony started really understanding the power of alcohol and what it could do for his own personality. And it was also during around this time when Tony went to his first rave in San Francisco. And this was in the late 90s in San Francisco. There was really a big underground rave scene movement. And he had friends that he knew from elementary school that that went to UC Berkeley. And so those were the people that introduced him to the rave scene in San Francisco. And that's when he started getting introduced to club drugs. And, he, in his book, Delivering Happiness, which is half a memoir, half a corporate manifesto, he really writes about these moments at these raves as almost like a religious experience. And he talks about how it was at these events under the influence of these drugs where he found a sense of community and he found that he could open himself up in a way that he never could have before. And so, he really wrote about it as a positive experience for him. But of course, it's a slippery slope. And, during his days building Link Exchange and right after selling it to Microsoft, I think that's really the beginnings of when you started seeing these addictive behaviors come to light with Tony.
And speaking of selling it to Microsoft, you wrote in the book how he was sad about that sale. It kind of wasn't enough. Yeah. And then later the $1 billion sale of Zappos to Amazon, wasn't enough. Was there any, why wasn't it enough? Was there anything that was enough?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think, he sold Link Exchange in his 20s for under $300 million. Then he sold Zappos in his 30s for over $1 billion. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he died at 46. From what we understand, in the last couple years before his passing, he was really looking for that next big break, for that next big exit, because that was what he had become accustomed to. And that is what he equated to as success, happiness, and really his identity. He had been known as being this Silicon Valley genius that could print money and could make anything into a success. And so Link Exchange was a success, so was Zappos. His next venture was Downtown Project, which ran into a lot of difficult issues under his tenure. It was a money-losing venture. He was attracting people to move to Las Vegas, but their businesses were not profitable. He had this music festival, Life is Beautiful, that was just losing money left and right. And he had, there was some pretty bad publicity around Downtown Project as well. There were a string of suicides in the community. So it was just, his next big venture was just not working out. And so when Downtown Project wasn't working out, during the last year of his life, he had a lot of grandiose ideas. And from what we understand, those ideas in his mind were supposed to be his next big exit, his next big success. And so, if you're constantly chasing an exit that's bigger than the last, that's just not sustainable. It really isn't. But that is sometimes that's how some people in Silicon Valley work. They want their success to be bigger than the last, but that's just a dangerous path to be towards. You're honestly setting yourself up for failure if that's what you expect of yourself.
But what's interesting is in both cases, and I don't know if he got stock in both cases. My guess is he did, because his wealth clearly kept growing through that time period.
He couldn't spend it fast enough.
Yeah, he couldn't spend it fast enough.
He could commit $350 million to downtown Vegas, and he could, even if he committed that, he'd probably make $1 billion in that same amount of time.
Yeah, and if you think, I don't know what percentage Zappos he owned, but if he owned 25% of Zappos, because he was the biggest investor in everything early on, who wouldn't take, $250 million of Amazon stock in 2009?
Right.
That's a pretty good investment. So the other, you talked about this, the exit in 2009, but then he spent 10 years as CEO. Mm-hmm. You didn't talk much in the book about the connection. He was working for Amazon, but was he? Was Amazon completely hands off?
Yeah, so the deal that he had with Amazon, they basically kept him on a pretty long leash. The deal was that, yes, we would acquire Zappos, but you're allowed to innovate and be in your little corner and be in your bubble and do really whatever it is that you wanted. Jeff Bezos, when the deal was announced, he made this video talking about why he decided to buy Zappos. And he was buying Zappos because of Tony's maniacal obsession with customer happiness. And Jeff Bezos, you can still look it up, it's on YouTube. He talks about how, it was under Tony, Alfred Lin, and Fred Mosler. These were the three leaders that were basically charting the new course as to how you operate customer success in the e-commerce marketplace. And Jeff Bezos was very impressed with what he saw in Tony's ideas and how you get customers to buy shoes, which before that point, that's like the one item that you have to try on before buying it, right?
Trust me, I know.
Right, exactly. You of all people would know. But Tony was able to get people to not only buy a pair of shoes they had never tried on, but he got them to buy 2 pairs, 3 pairs, 4 pairs, because of the return policy, which is that you can return whatever items you wanted at whatever time frame. There was no limit to when you could return it, which was just an idea that nobody had thought of up until that point. It's a very simple idea, but it's a genius idea.
Right. It's a little bit of the Nordstrom's customer
right,
service,
exactly, which
right.
is where Fred Mosler came from, which was the other his other lieutenant.
Right.
And so that was what Amazon was buying. That was what they were buying. And so after the acquisition happened, the deal was Zappos had a very long leash. They could innovate and experiment however way they wanted, and that was how it was kept up until the last year of Tony's life.
When they essentially replaced Tony, a little bit of question about whether Tony resigned or was replaced.
Yes, from our reporting, the official line was that Tony resigned. but from what we understand, it got to a point, basically the executives at Amazon were not really told about what was going on with Tony up until the very last couple months. And when they understood what was happening, they had to take action. And so that's what our reporting showed.
So the ultimate crash, and I want to talk a little bit about ketamine and when that kicked in and everything, but the ultimate crash happened in 2020, several months after the pandemic. You started reporting on this around that time and then shortly thereafter. But now we're it almost feels like we're enough far away from the pandemic to have some perspective. I'm sure a year from now we'll have even more perspective.
Yeah.
But how much of that ultimate crash was driven by the isolation that we all felt during the pandemic?
I think it was a big part of it. Leading up to the pandemic, when COVID shut the world down, Tony was living a very fast lifestyle. He was constantly on the road. He was going from conferences to festivals to big events to speaking engagements. And it was a lot of distractions, frankly, to keep him from really reflecting and looking at, the state of his life. So when all those events stopped, it was really the first time in a long time where Tony had to sit still. And Tony never liked to sit still. We interviewed this woman named Antonia Dodge, who was a personality assessor for Zappos. It was something, they hired her to basically do, she assessed the personalities of all the Zappos executives as like a retreat event. And she told me that when she interviewed Tony, she had never interviewed somebody that was so resistant to looking inward. And that when she asked him questions like, what is your relationship with alone time? The way that she described it was that she literally saw him curl inward because of how uncomfortable he was with those types of questions. And so he was never the type of person that enjoyed sitting still and enjoyed any level of self-reflection on his own life. And so when COVID happened and all we had was time and all we did was sit at home, it was kind of the perfect storm for somebody that already was susceptible to addiction issues to, fall down that path. So I think the fact that this happened during the pandemic is no coincidence. I think it's all related.
So he had started ketamine before the pandemic. Had he started, to your knowledge, nitrous oxide and that sort of thing beforehand as well, or?
So our reporting showed that he was exposed to ketamine in a significant way during Burning Man of 2019. And it was during this event where he was told that ketamine was this miracle drug. It could cure depression, you would never get a hangover, and it's just the drug of choice that everybody wants to do at that moment in time. And so it was really at Burning Man 2019 where he really went deep with ketamine. And in Las Vegas, there's this place called the Airstream Park. It's a series of Airstream trailers. It's a community that Tony built. And him and his friends, during the holidays, they would always do this thing called winter camp, where everybody would come together in December for a couple weeks and just, hang out, make s'mores in the fireplace and just, have these social events. And it was during winter camp 2019-2020 when his friends started becoming concerned about Tony's ketamine usage. And it was during those months when we had a source who told us that he saw Tony snort 3 to 5 grams of ketamine in a single day. That was the worst moment during winter camp. And it was really during that time when his friends really started realizing, oh, I don't think that this isn't just, Tony, having a good time for a weekend, that there's something actually wrong here. And it was actually during winter camp when there were some attempts at an intervention. But at that moment in time, Tony was still, he was still the Tony Hsieh. The people that were around him, they tried their best to stage interventions, but at the end of the day, he was still Tony. And so they all thought that he would just snap out of it, and he would be okay if he just took a little bit of time.
It seems, I mean, one of the things that, again, reading the book, that you get a sense of is he had built such a bubble around himself, which he was able to do because of his wealth, that it was basically impenetrable.
Yes, and it just got worse the older he got, right? Like, there was a conversation that he had with Nick Swinmurn in the late 2010s, where he bragged to Nick, oh, my friends just keep getting younger and younger. And that was something that Tony bragged about, and he was proud of that. But when you think about that, you know, we talked a bit about the early days of Zappos when he had these two core lieutenants, Fred Mosler and Alfred Lin. And these two eventually left Zappos in the early 2010s. And, you know, both of them are now married with children. And a lot of Tony's contemporaries are also married with children. But Tony never married, and he never had kids. And instead, while those people, they told us that they in some ways they outgrew Tony, because Tony just never grew up. He was just sort of stuck in this Peter Pan mode, which is sort of the inspiration of Wonder Boy, the title, because he was called a Wonder Boy as a kid. And the more that we reported the story, we realized that there was a part of Tony that never left that part of his mind. His growth was stunted, and he just never grew up. And so, yeah, I think like with Tony, there was like a big Peter Pan, there was a level of Peter Pan syndrome that was very apparent in his life.
That it seemed, again, through the book, that the only person that was willing to sort of try to penetrate that bubble was Jewel. I mean, of all people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, she was in a unique position because, you know, she wasn't on his payroll. And I think that she, you know, Jewel's an interesting character because obviously she's a singer, she's a celebrity in her own right, but, you know, she met Tony on Richard Branson's island. She knows Elon Musk well. And so she is, you know, a part of the artist community, but she's also very entrenched in the entrepreneurial community. And when she saw Tony in the last year of his life, there was no hesitation in her to basically tell Tony, you are killing yourself. And everybody that you are surrounding yourself with, they're all on your payroll. You've offered to double their highest W-2 just to be with you. So of course they're not going to tell you that there's something wrong with you, and I'm the only person that can see the truth. And so, yeah, Jewel was, she was in a unique position, and yeah, I respect what she tried to do in the last year of Tony's life.
But obviously, ultimately, it was unsuccessful.
Yeah.
Was like when you look back, and I'm sure you talked to different people who said, "Oh, if only this, if only that."
Yeah.
Is there something somewhere much earlier where, you know, he could have been steered off that course, do you think?
I mean, that's so hard to answer. I think it's, you know, the reason why it was so hard to intervene was because we as a society tend to think that these figures, these people who are in power and these people who have amassed a lot of wealth, that they themselves are impenetrable, that they themselves are too smart to go down the path of addiction or are too smart to just surround themselves with yes men. There has to be some people around them that can put the brakes. When the reality, especially in Tony's case, that wasn't true. For how smart Tony was, he did not have the wherewithal to surround himself with people, with lieutenants that could tell him no. And so I think it's more of an indictment on how we treat people like Tony, on how we treat successful founders and how we treat them as these mythical figures that can do no wrong, when in fact, at the end of the day, they're human. And more often than not, they're the people who do need people like you or me to tell them, like, no, what you're doing is stupid, or no, you're killing yourself and you really need to stop. So I think it's more of like what we should do as a society to change that kind of a mindset, to change how we view these types of people and not just view them as completely bulletproof.
Although, I mean, if you talk to a bunch of different people who work with people who are ultimately very, very successful, you see some that realize they live in a bubble and realize that the world that they see isn't necessarily the world that everyone else sees, but that helps them stay grounded. And then others who don't stay grounded, and clearly Tony was one that was not grounded at that point.
No, and I spoke with a CEO in Wall Street who said that he hires for his blind spots. Mm-hmm. So the people that he has as his lieutenants are good at areas where he's weak. And I think that that's a really important point. And I don't think that Tony necessarily did that, particularly in the last year of his life.
After Albert and Fred left.
Exactly, right? After Alfred and after Fred. Because when you look at the people that he surrounded himself with at Zappos in the last couple of years, it was really people who, would just say yes to his whims and would just enable his crazy ideas, like building an open bar in the lobby of Zappos. Like, that was an idea that he had. And his number 2 fungineer said, okay, I'll make it happen. But
for the life of me, why Amazon didn't get wind of that and say something about that?
Long leash.
It's a really long leash.
Yeah.
Tony's family chose not to participate in the book. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that? And is there anything that maybe you gleaned from the fact that they wouldn't about the story?
So our intent, we always wanted the family's participation. And right when we started, from the very beginning of the reporting of the book, we reached out to the family directly. We wrote a handwritten letter to the father, specifically Richard, and we mailed it to the house. And we were told by people who were close to the family that they had gotten the letter and that they were considering participating in the book. And throughout various parts of reporting the book, we would just keep them up to date with where we were. Eventually, we got in touch with their lawyers. And then we started just updating the lawyers instead of the family directly. We were told that the lawyers basically advised the family to not talk to the media until the lawsuits had settled. Because right after Tony died, there were a series of people who basically came out with creditors' claims, suing the estate for money that they felt was owed to them.
Some of the biggest grifters of all.
Right, based on deals that had been signed in Tony's last year of his life, based on services that were provided. And so some of these claims are actually still ongoing. And so the lawyers essentially advised the family to not talk to the media until all those lawsuits were settled. But in the process of those cases, the family decided to take a stand and state that all of these deals that were made in Tony's last year and a half of his life, they should all be voided because Tony was not in the right state of mind to be making any of these deals. And so to prove that point, the family had to get very honest in their complaint in response to the lawsuits. And so, they revealed things that no parent should have to reveal to the public about their own son. They stated that he suffered from depression, that he had various prescriptions to Xanax for anxiety, Adderall for ADHD. They just made they were very frank about Tony's struggles with mental health to essentially make this case that they shouldn't have to pay any of these people anything. How far back did the ADHD and Xanax and that sort of thing go? The lawsuit didn't say.
Okay.
But so we were told that though the family can't talk to the press, they've been advised not to, and they're going to choose to listen to their legal counsel. Their response to these lawsuits was essentially the family's way of providing their perspective on what exactly happened in the last 5 years of Tony's life. And so when that complaint came out, which came out about a month before we had to stop writing the book, before it had to go to the press, we incorporated as much as we could from the family's complaint into the end of the book, because that was their perspective, and it was their way of providing their voice for all future stories. But it was always our intention to get the family's participation, and I really wish we had been able to talk to them directly for the book. But the book is not the end.
No. And so speaking of, and there kind of is no end, but in the aftermath, what's happened with the downtown project? What's happened with the sort of irons he had in the fire that were real things?
The downtown project is really a shell of itself at this point. If you go to downtown Vegas, you'll still see shortly after Tony's passing, there were all these murals that had been erected in Tony's memory, and those are still up. Those are still a part of downtown Vegas. But a lot of the businesses that he supported, from coffee shops to restaurants, a lot of them have shuttered or moved. A lot of the tech companies that he supported actually closed down years before he died. But a lot of his efforts in revitalizing downtown Vegas are really left to the wayside. And the family has a decision to essentially either keep supporting downtown project or to just let it go. And from what we've seen, the family, they've been selling real estate in downtown Vegas. I mean, Tony, when he was alive, he owned plots of land in downtown Vegas with the hope of developing them into businesses, into parks, and he had all these grand ideas for remaking downtown Vegas. But the family, they've been selling plots of land. So I think it's safe to say that the downtown project, it may not exist in a couple years.
When, reporting this story must have been hard. As I said, I think everyone that was in this orbit when they heard the initial, he died, young man, and drugs were involved, sadness, but then anger. What do you think can be learned for future entrepreneurs? For what lessons can be taken out of this? Is there some good that can come out of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think back to one of the conversations that I had with a source of mine who was a really close friend of Tony's. And he was really struggling to decide whether he was going to talk for the book or not. And at the very end, he decided to talk. And so I just asked him, what changed your mind? Like, was it, something that, did something happen? Was it something that you thought? Was it something that I said? And he basically said, if by telling Tony's story, it could prevent another person from going down a similar path, if it just prevents one person from going down that path, then my participation will have been worth it. And I think with Tony's story, there's so many lessons that you can pull from this, but if we're talking about mental health in Silicon Valley, there's a part in the book where we talk about the connection between entrepreneurs and hypomania. And hypomania is essentially a milder form of mania that's associated with manic depressive states. And the way that you define hypomanics is that they are almost irrationally confident. They are very high energy, and they almost feel like they've been chosen to change the world in a positive way. And if you think about that, you can probably describe a lot of Silicon Valley founders in that way. You kind of have to have that gumption to think that you can do it, and to want to leave that safe 9-to-5 office job to build a company out of an idea.
Irrational optimism.
Irrational optimism, exactly. But with hypomanics is that while they experience the highs of highs, they also experience the lows in a much lower way than the average person. And when you think about the life cycle of a founder and the life cycle of a company, there's going to be a lot of boom and bust cycles that a company goes through before it becomes successful, if it becomes successful. And so as a founder, if your identity is tied so much to the success of your company, that means you are that much more susceptible to a depressive state if your company goes through a difficult chapter or winds down. And so again, if we're talking specifically about mental health in Silicon Valley, I think we need to recognize that while founders are very daring and they have very lofty mission and goals, and it's great that they do, they are more susceptible to potentially developing mental health conditions than the average human being. We cite studies in the book that show that entrepreneurs, they show a higher level of either mental health conditions in themselves or mental health conditions reported in their families than the average person. And so I think that that's really something that the community in Silicon Valley should just recognize, especially if your day-to-day job is dealing with founders and entrepreneurs.
One of the pieces of advice that I give a lot of entrepreneurs is to find a co-founder. Because one of the challenges with the crucible of a startup is the ups and downs are really bad. And when things are really down, it's helpful to have somebody else who's kind of in the trenches with you.
Yeah, no, I think it's really good advice. And that's something that Tony was missing in the last couple of years of his life, for sure.
Co-founders also can question your wisdom. And he had those people, but then when they left, he didn't.
Yeah, he never replaced them with the same kind of co-founders.
Do you think in any way, I mean, Tony's legacy is, he has a tremendous legacy, but do you think this story maybe impact his legacy as a visionary in any way, in any kind of negative way, or does it just make him more real as a human being?
I think it should just make him more real as a human being. I mean, I think even the most consequential figures in human history are extremely complicated. Yeah. You're not going to find, you know, somebody that changed the history of a generation be simple. And so I think it's the same case with Tony. I think that it shouldn't harm his legacy in any way. It should just paint him as a person who was human and had very intense demons. And he tried to fight those demons for a long time, and he lost that battle. But it doesn't mean that all the good that he did in this world should be erased and forgotten. And I hope that people don't forget that, even though he died in such a tragic circumstance.
When you report on this story, obviously we talked about the drugs and ketamine and the impact they had. And ketamine's been all in the news in the last year and change. Yeah. When you read these stories, does it make you uncomfortable about, given what happened to him? And
Yeah. No, I mean, there have been a lot of stories about ketamine being used in a clinical setting. There's been a lot of literature out there that shows that ketamine can help with certain mental health conditions, namely depression. And that's one of the reasons that drew Tony to ketamine. But I think there's a difference between
self-medicating.
Yeah, there's a difference between self-medicating and snorting 3 to 5 grams of ketamine a day versus having ketamine injected in a supervised setting. And it's not a thin line. It's actually a very thick line between like clinical and just snorting, right? But I just think that that's something that you need to remember about. The people need to remember about ketamine. And if Tony's story can help with that, then great.
The part of the bubble that he was able to build was a result of, was part of, he was living in 3 different places. He was in California, he was in Nevada, he was in Utah, yeah. And they kind of weren't able to pin him down. Are there any lessons to be drawn from that? I mean, if, I don't know how many people here are going to have somebody who's a billionaire friend who needs to, someone to penetrate their bubble, but yeah. It's a real thing.
It completely is. And for Tony, from what we understood, his family actually they explored putting Tony into a conservatorship. And because he was moving around so much, that made it that much more difficult to put him to a conservatorship, because there's a lot of different hurdles that you have to go through to prove to the courts that this person deserves to be held under a conservatorship. They need to be admitted to a hospital, and a doctor has to state that this person is mentally and physically incapacitated. And then you need a lawyer to sign off on that. And if a person is constantly moving around and you don't even know what city they're in, how are you going to figure out what hospital to potentially try to get them checked into? And so I don't quite know what the lesson is there, because when you're dealing with a billionaire, this billionaire is probably going to have a private jet that can go anywhere they want, right? But again, I think it's about having that support system and knowing that you need that support system and having people around you that can tell you need that support system.
Right. And giving up control to that support system.
And giving up control, which was something that Tony
was not going to
didn't really like doing.
Yeah. Angel, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.